Hey, everybody, peace and blessings, and welcome. Hope you all are well on this Sunday evening. And I am excited to be here with you all today to do part five of reading The Choice. And so I'm excited to be here. And for those of you who have not tuned in to the channel before, this is Zakia Sankara Jabbar, Real Talk with ZSJ. And I'm doing this reading of The Choice, the issue of Black survival in America. And the reason why I'm reading this book is because I think we need to have a foundational understanding for the current economic moment we're in, the fourth industrial revolution that's currently taking place in the economy, and that connection to Black financial health and Black people in general. This book was authored by Samuel Yette. Samuel Yette was he was a journalist, an investigative journalist, and he was the very first Black journalist for the Washington, D.C. Bureau for Newsweek magazine. And the book was written in 1971 originally. And so the book is 50 years old. And so some of the things that you're hearing in here will actually sound like it's still actually happening today, because some of the things that he's raising in this book is actually still happening today. So we have to figure out how we can change our material conditions to improve over the last 50 years and beyond. So without further ado, we're actually starting on page 178, part 4. We had just started a new chapter, and I'm trying to get back to the very beginning of this chapter, which we were just a couple of pages in, I believe. Let me see. Yeah. So yeah, this is chapter 5, and chapter 5 is entitled The Threat and Tactics. The Threat and Tactics. So now we're on page 178. I want to encourage everybody to like the video and share it. Please like the video and share it so that people can come in and get this audio reading of this book, which is out of print and very expensive to try to get on Amazon. In fact, it's really too expensive. So that's actually the reason why I'm actually reading the book for people, to get this information out to the community. So if you like listening to audiobooks, this will be a similar experience. All right, so without further ado, we're starting on page 178, and this is a part of chapter 5. To be sure, there was parody, even a touch of satire, in that Black Declaration of Independence, but taken in its context, along with the statements of Bishop Spotwood and Field Director Current of the NAACP, this Black Declaration of Independence left no doubt whatever of the extreme danger and hopelessness in which Black Americans had begun to view their predicament. Nor was the fear of impending destruction limited to the Black people who feel especially vulnerable. Perceptive Blacks occasionally make the case that Black Americans would not have survived the 60s had it not been for the intervention of the hippies, who served as lightning rods, drawing the fire momentarily away from Blacks, or as insulation between the Blacks and the ruling parents of the hippies. Evidence that this kind of substitution was a real and present danger to those regarded as hippies was provided in a series of articles by James S. Cunin, author of the Strawberry Statement. While the hippies have been more generally identified with anti-war protests than civil rights for African Americans, one of the final and lasting contributions of Dr. King was to integrate the two issues. This has lent fuel to the claims that the civil rights movement and Dr. King died together. What may be more true is that by the time he died, the civil rights issue has simply become a part of a wider, more pervasive struggle for world peace and justice. James Baldwin, the Black writer and expatriate, viewed the Afro-American crisis from Istanbul, Turkey at the end of 1969 and concluded that the Black and white Americans are on a collision course. Quote, what we call the civil rights struggle can be said to have been buried with Martin Luther King, because as of that event and the arrival of the new administration, it began to be very clear to Black people in the United States that what Time magazine and Newsweek calls the troubled American is not going to listen, does not want to know, does not want to hear the truth about the situation of the American Black. Now, I know America has gotten itself into a place it does not know how to get out of. It's been coming for a very long time. Now, here we are. What happens is anyone's guess. It seems very unlikely to me that there is enough moral energy left in most white Americans to accomplish the miracle which is now demanded. I hope I am wrong. James Baldwin. One aspect of the threat Americans increasingly envisioned at the outset of the 70s is the similarity of alarm by those, such as Baldwin, who viewed the nation's course in a historical context. The year-end 1969 meeting the American Historical Association in Washington, D.C., was punctuated with learned warnings and incessant parallels drawn between the United States in 1970 and Germany of the 40 years earlier. Meeting in the last week of 1969, the historians reeked and reeled with discussions about the alleged Song Mai and My Lai massacres and the police murders of Black Panthers in Chicago and elsewhere around the country. During a speech to some 2,000 historians by Walt Rothschild, former foreign policy advisor to President Johnson, several dozen radical historians marched down the center of the aisle meeting hall carrying signs that read, Rostow, accomplice of war. Historians say Nixon's a racist at home and abroad. Historians for peace. Historians protest the repression of Black Panthers and stop U.S. genocide at home and abroad. A group of about 300 of the historians, led by Arthur Wastow of the Institute for Policy Studies and Howard Zinn, Boston University, followed the demonstration with a march to the Justice Department. Genocide will come to America, Richard Drennan of Bucknell said, and Huey P. Long put it as a kind of hyper-Americanism. Most of the killers in the 20th century are usually well-dressed people. Drennan's comments were fairly typical of the few hundred historians who regarded themselves as radicals, but perhaps of greater significance were the similar views expressed by the hierarchy or establishment of the AHA. C. Van Woodward, Sterling Professor of History at Yale University and outgoing president of the AHA, stated, and I quote, the integrity of the academic community and the university and intellectual community is being challenged now for political purposes, in some ways comparable to the dictator's assault on those two communities in Germany in the early 1930s. I want to qualify that by saying that many of the purposes of the attack in America are often nobler than those in Germany in the 30s. The results are, nevertheless, very similar. Specifically on the Black-white situation, Woodard continued, Blacks are upward bound and on a collision course with white reaction. I think that white reaction is ominous, massive, and dangerous. And I think some of the forces that have resisted it during this period of the Second Reconstruction have been depleted and are apathetic, end quote. In a similar vein, John K. Fairbank, head of the Far Eastern Studies at Harvard University, said that if he were Black, undoubtedly, I would be apprehensive about my safety in America. Any minority group will have its fears, and there have been examples to justify them, end quote. The clearest incident and warning of the threat of the historians saw for America, however, came in the form of a resolution put forward by a radical historian caucus. Although the resolution was rejected by the convention, many historians, such as Woodward and Fairbank, said they agreed with the sentiment or purposes of the resolution, but voted against it rather than politicize the organization. The caucus called it a resolution on war and repression. Quote, resolved that as citizens and historians, we recognize and find intolerable the present direction of the American government. In order to extend the modern American empire by waging war against the people of Vietnam, the government has increasingly moved to repress political opposition at home. Moreover, the physical and cultural destruction of the Vietnamese people reflects a much older and deeper policy of physical and cultural destruction of the Black community at home, and is now being carried into new versions of racism by the administration in its betrayal of civil rights and its aid to counterinsurgent police forces in the great cities. The political assassination of Black Panther Party is the most blatant example. The Justice Department is acting as the domestic pentagon in this repression. These murderous policies and the repression which enforces them are increasingly restricting our freedom as historians and have even our classrooms and grade books into channels of conscription and death, have affected the life of our campuses and have deeply disturbed relations between teachers and students of history. Even more important than the damage they have done to our profession, they are undermining the possibility of self-determination and democracy in the American and world society whose history we study. We cannot stand by in silence. To do so is to condone the abuses to which history has been subjected in the service of power, to condone a kind of intellectual pacification program. To say nothing at this point in our own history is to express our indifference to what is happening around us. The business of this convention is history. We must renew our commitment to one of the great historic tasks of independent historians in times of crisis. We must expose to critical analysis and public attack to disastrous direction in which our government is taking us. We therefore demand the immediate withdrawal of all American troops from Vietnam, the immediate end of all harassment of the Black Panther Party, and the release of all political prisoners, such as the Chicago 8. End quote. I don't even know if we have radical academics like that anymore, because most of them on Twitter are completely connected to empire, even though they claim to be, progressive or whatever, but they're elitist, and they're certainly considered left, but they're very elitist, and they certainly don't stand with the people. Similarly, Whitney M. Young, director of the National Urban League, drew fearful conclusions from his assessment of the first Nixon year. So moderate have been Young's views that most aggressive civil rights activists have been known to refer derogatory to him as Whitney, as Whitey Young. Wow. Nonetheless, his conclusions about the threat to all Black Americans coincides with those of the most critical cynics, the most cynical critics. Here's a quote from Whitney Young. "This has been a year of broad retreat from the societal reformism that has marked the decade of the 60s. The year has been marked by a growing and dangerous mood of repression that threatens the civil liberties of all of us. The undeclared war on radical groups like Black Panthers by the police have left many dead and a feeling of bitterness in the ghetto. Shrill calls for law and order have resulted in greater oppression, denial of justice. The national mood seems to be one of drifting towards a harsh, repressive society rather than the open, democratic one that has always been the American ideal. The recent report of the Eisenhower Commission, like the reports of the many commissions that preceded it, gave fresh warning of the self-defeating and frightening course this nation is on." End quote. That's from Whitney Young. He is one of the founders, and at the time he was the director of the National Urban League. And I'll save my comments on the current Urban League. The choice the nation had made by the end of the decisive decade clearly was a serious threat to the survival of Black people in America. America has not failed because her professions were wrong, Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor rightly told the students at Hampton Institute. Go anywhere in the world, and nowhere is the promise of human dignity so clearly spelled out, so carefully defined, so neatly described, end quote. Yet another kind of truth was cruelly vented to a session of the Black Power Conference in fire-swept Newark in the summer of 1967. In a session where well-dressed, well-mannered, mostly academic types discussed educational problems and how education might be used to help solve the problem, a petite brown-skinned lady from Chicago rose and began to give a polite and learned dissertation on how whites had used the school system, in fact, to further the enslavement of Blacks. Others joined in, all citing instances of the same predicament. But most thought that as an emerging Black sophistication would ultimately enable Blacks to turn the corner educationally and win the day for Black people. Suddenly, a medium to smallish Black youth, about 19 or 20, shot onto the floor from his chair. One of several dozen staggered in a kind of circle. Quote, "This is bullshit," he shouted. "Pure damn bullshit." The room of academics gasped, then fell into a stony silence. "What the fuck are we doing sitting here talking all this education jazz?" exclaimed the youth in a green t-shirt fitting tightly around his muscular shoulders and forearms. "The action is downtown at the damn jailhouse." During the uprisings of the recent days, many Blacks had been arrested, some of them persons who would have otherwise been active in the conference. This green t-shirted youth was one of many who felt the conference should not adjourn, indeed would fail without getting those arrested out of jail. "Young man," the lady from Chicago interrupted, "there are ways to do things. The way not to do them is the way you're behaving. If you're getting them out of jail, if getting them out of jail is a thing to do, then we should get a lawyer and assign him to get a writ and get them out." "Shit," pounded the young Black man, his massive fist slamming on the table. "You niggers are always talking about how you're going to outfox Whitey. When? That's what I'd like to know. When? Well, goddammit, I've been looking all my damn life and I ain't seen you outsmart Whitey yet," end quote. "Now look, don't get me wrong." He began to rock a bit from the heels to the balls of his feet. "I ain't trying to turn nobody off. See, nobody that wants to help Black people get out of this shit. What I'm telling you though is that you cats that's supposed to be so fucking smart ain't showing me nothing. Whitey beating your ass at every turn. Look," he said, beginning to shake with emotion, "I don't know shit about books, okay? Okay, I'll give you that. So I'd be willing to let you do your shit, but you ain't doing it. You dig? And you ain't never gonna do it. Beat Whitey, cause he got you following some fucking book. Shit. When Whitey gets ready to off one of us, he lets you follow that damn book while he goes and get his knife and cut our balls out while you smart niggas are still reading." "Look," he said, fumbling in his pockets and coming out with a pack of paper matches. "Look, like I said, I don't know about books, but that don't matter, because that ain't where Whitey's at," end quote. He began poking the air with his match pack. "Whitey's just like me. When he means business, he says to hell with them books. I can't outsmart Whitey and I know it, but god damn it, I sure can light a fire to his ass, and that's what the fuck I'm gonna do. Can't nobody beat me doing it. I'm going out here and do what I know I can do," end quote. With that, the rugged little Black man in the green t-shirt stomped out of the room. Silence rushed in. For the next hour, the educators at the Newark Black Power Conference pondered a special kind of truth. For ideology, Whitey uses books. For results, he uses tactics. And yet, Proctor's truth is wholly relevant to the question of Black survival in America. The basic threats to that survival can obtain only outside the protections guaranteed to every United States citizen by the Constitution. The warnings of cracker gas, cracker law, and cracker jury notwithstanding, centrally focused then must be those guarantees and their erosion, particularly during the last half of the decisive decade. Columnist Carl Rowan, who once served as ambassador to Sweden and later as director of the United States Information Agency, saw the dangers of such erosion during the 1968 presidential campaign, which included the candidacy of former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Quote, "The single most important reason why fascism is possible in America is not Wallace, a very insignificant man in his own right," Rowan wrote, "but the fact that the people are today so preoccupied with their fears, frustrations, and prejudices that they seem ready to abdicate from the solemn responsibility to protect our constitutional safeguards," end quote. Then Rowan continued, quote, "There are two ways to circumvent or trample over a constitution, however ingeniously contrived may be its democratic precepts. One way is to arouse public fear and hatred to a point where all concepts of minority protection or right of dissent get swept away in a tide of emotion." That sound familiar with right now? It is not mere coincidence that the current spate of fear and hatred over crime in the streets and Negro aggressiveness is accompanied by an attack on the U.S. Supreme Court. But the would-be fascists prepare for every eventuality. In case they can't turn the public completely against the court, they want to alter its membership and in the way alter the zeal with which it would apply the safeguards against fascism that are built into the Constitution. The second way to abrogate the Constitution is to amass enough police or military power to force your will upon a society, end quote. During the 5-year period from the Watts Rebellion in August 1965 through the first year of the Nixon administration, the nation experienced genuinely traumatic and potentially disastrous erosions of constitutional guarantees. Civil upheaval sprang from unlivable and unjust conditions, but troops and Nazi police tactics, not amelioration of conditions, followed. A Nixon administration Southern strategy was seen by many as feeding distrust and division, and critics saw proof of President Nixon's willingness to create a police state in his quick call in of troops to deliver the mail during the mail strike in March 1970. In the meantime, mass exterminations ruled justifiable homicides of Black Panthers and other discontented Blacks continued. Data banks were expanded to control those who sought to exercise their constitutional rights to associate freely, with even the crossing of state lines becoming a suspect matter and inciting a riot a frequent charge. Civil libertarians who might oppose such methods were similarly intimidated. In the first month of the Nixon administration, Jet Magazine's managing director, John H. Britton, cited numerous aggressive Black leaders who had escaped death in the violence that encompasses them, but who were nonetheless candidates to be either jailed or forced to flee the country while they lived. The more outspoken Black radicals who 2 years ago collected as high as $1,500 a speech for their verbal flagellations on the lecture circuit are more likely now to collect prison denims and are less likely to be free to move about the United States. Criminal indictments, arrests, maximum jail terms for alleged petty offenses, and other forms of legal straitjacketing are slowly and surely putting a bind most visible leaders of radical causes. In 1968, the roll call of radical Black defendants is long and growing longer. Start with Rap Brown himself. He's still in jail, y'all, down in Georgia in a federal prison. Attorney William Kunstler of New York told Jet his celebrated client is up against 14 criminal counts in 4 states and the District of Columbia. Brown is now appealing a 5-year sentence imposed following conviction on a federal gun charge in New Orleans, and he is due to go on trial soon in Maryland on a charge of arson that carries a maximum penalty of 10 years. Stokely Carmichael, the firebrand former chairman of SNCC, is facing riot charges in Atlanta that could bring a maximum of 10 years. Phil Hutchings, current SNCC chairman, faces trial in St. Louis, as does John Wilson, a Chicago SNCC man who leads the Black Anti-Draft Anti-War Union. In Texas, SNCC man Lee Otis Johnson of Houston, Matthew Johnson of Austin, and Ernie McMillan of Dallas face jail terms. Crunchler said Lee Otis Johnson drew 30 years for alleged sale of one marijuana cigarette. SNCC's Cleveland Sellers is appealing a 5-year sentence on conviction of draft evasion and faces inciting to riot charges in Orangeburg, South Carolina. In Houston, five Texas Southern University students face murder charges in connection with the death of a policeman during a campus uprising, even though prosecutors admit most of the youngers were nowhere near the scene when the officer was slain. Black Panthers from coast to coast are feeling the heat. Eldridge Cleaver is hunted by the FBI as a parole violator. Huey P. Newton is already in a California prison. Panther Captain John Ford of New York faces trial on misdemeanor charges. Panther Chairman Bobby Seale is under restrictive probation in Oakland. Panther headquarters in Newark, Denver, and San Francisco have been attacked by bombs and bullets. Policemen were suspended in connection with the San Francisco incident. Indeed, in the last half of the decisive decade, unconstitutional tactics ushered in a substantial police state, potentially a prelude to the broader consequences feared by many. Some of the police action, of course, is in response to violence and disruption on the part of the Black poor and others. There is the question, however, as to what extent these disruptions are mandated by conditions deliberately imposed by the controllers in the society and enforced by the police. The centuries of white racism, dutifully reported by the Kerner Commission in 1968, sprouted its inevitable fruit in Watts, Newark, Detroit, Chicago, and scores of other cities throughout the nation. These riots, as the Kerner Commission study revealed, were not really riots at all. Rather, they were the reaction of a small but significant minority of the Negro population, fairly representative of the ghetto residents, who were engaging in a protest against the essential conditions of life there, and an indicator of the necessity for fundamental changes in American society. The society did so little to ameliorate the conditions that the Kerner Commission released a second report a year later, pointing out that in many places, such as Newark, the situation had deteriorated further and the likelihood for violence had increased. So clear was this failure and the negative responses that some observers, such as Columbia University sociologist Amitai Etziani, saw them as a tactic of making riots mandatory. Explains Etziani, quote, despite repeated assertions by President Johnson that the United States is rich enough to have both guns and butter, the country spent more in Saigon alone than in all American cities combined. The war costs now per annum total $24.5 billion by government estimates, $32 billion by U.S. Senate sources. The war on poverty is funded at approximately $2 billion a year. This was the background for the severest riots in the U.S. has known in decades. Riots which erupted in Detroit and in Newark in the summer of 1967. The Congress has since cut back those domestic programs which benefit the underclass, including bills aimed at control of rats in slums, welfare for mothers and children, and the Job Corps. Meanwhile, the National Guards have purchased more and heavier arms. The White House responded to the riots by calling for a national day of prayer and by appointing the Commission on Civil Disorders. As James Reston pointed out at the time, this was an attempt to handle the politics of the situation rather than the situation itself. As Estedani points out, the Kerner Commission predicted that to pursue our present course will involve the continuing polarization of the American community and ultimately the destruction of the basic democratic values. This predictability of violence as a reaction mandated by society was put just as accurately, if in less scholarly fashion, by white writer Jimmy Breslin. "If I were Black that lived in Newark, I'd riot," end quote. The degree to which Black people, even non-radical Blacks, see their people forced into potential riotous incidents to gain constitutional rights manifests itself in the pronouncements of several distinguished Black public servants. On the narrowest possible vote, 7-6, the National Commission on Crime and Violence, the Eisenhower Commission, decided in its 1969 report that massive civil disobedience was not an acceptable tactic to be used to counter the unconstitutional tactics employed by the government, its officials, and others in society. But two Black members of the commission, Mrs. Patricia Roberts Harris, a law professor at Howard University, and Judge A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. of Philadelphia, both dissented. They disagreed with the commission's view that aggrieved persons should abide by the law involved until it is declared unconstitutional, end quote. Under the test of a single individual, disrupting that argument, Judge Higginbotham said, and I quote, "If the majority's doctrine of everyone wait until outcomes of one individual test case had been applied by Black Americans in the 1960s, probably not one present major civil rights statute would have been enacted. I fear that the majority's position ignores the sad actual history of Negroes in this country," end quote. The inevitability of riots as a concomitant to white racism and benign neglect becomes clear, and entrenchments against unacceptable methods to redress grievances become academic. This fact was underscored by the Chicago Daily Defender editorial agreement with Black Nobel Peace Prize winner Dr. Ralph Bunche, that such tactics as those employed by the Nixon administration actually caused Black crime and disorder. Under an editorial entitled "Nixon and Racism," the Defender indicated the tactic of requiring violent behavior, which in turn would require police action. Quote, Dr. Ralph Bunche, a distinguished undersecretary of the United Nations, expressed the view that he, like other Negro leaders, had little confidence that the Nixon administration would move forward on the crucial problem of racism. Quote, Black leaders in the United States do not have great confidence in the Nixon administration to advance. He said he shared the conviction that there is little Black confidence in Nixon, in Attorney General Mitchell, or Vice President Agnew. Though he is opposed to violence as being an impractical way to redress the wrongs done to the American Blacks, Dr. Bunche warned that there would be more race riots unless action was taken in earnest to remedy the insufferable conditions of poor Blacks. The Nixon administration is not heeding the warnings that both conservative and militant Negro leaders have sounded. So engrossed is Mr. Nixon in devising a political scheme by which to give gratification to the implacable races below the Mason-Dixon line that he has neither the time nor the inclination to correct the injustices and give rise to frustrations and turmoil in Black slums, end quote. Eisenhower never once backed up the Supreme Court school desegregation order. Negro publishers pled with him to put the presidential prestige behind the court's mandate, but to no avail. Mr. Eisenhower had no use for the court after its May 17, 1954 decision. It was too liberal for him. President Nixon was just as critical of the Warren Court as was Ike. Eisenhower thought the court had gone too far in outlawing racial imbalance in the nation's public schools. Nixon is in demonstrably simple sympathy with the South's refusal to comply with the mandate. He has been in power a year. So far, he has done little to show that he is concerned about the full constitutional guarantees of civil rights for Black citizenry. Yes, we agree with Dr. Bunch as to the character and depth of existing racial dissatisfaction and the riots that may ensue. Riots there will be, for the president is doing nothing to douse the fire of racial unrest. Thus, as the Kerner Commission indicated, pursuing the same courses of white racism and what Moynihan calls benign neglect could have only the easily predictable result, riots and police oppression as justifiable responses. This, the green-shirted youth in Newark would call, quote, whitey tactics, resulting at best in non-deliberate genocide. This level of tactics eventually bypasses the lofty alternatives Proctor held up to the Hampton students. The failure to ameliorate the conditions of white racism requires troops and extreme police tactics to suppress the natural growth of resentment fertilized for generations in Newark and elsewhere. These police tactics were not curative, but catalytic. A firm resolve to deal with the increased resentment resulted in the Nixon-Agnew election. In the first Nixon-Agnew-Mitchell year, U.S. constitutional guarantees slipped disastrously. For example, the federal concern for such rudimentary guarantees as voting rights and an equal chance for a job for Black citizens deteriorated quickly. Established civil rights policies regarding school desegregation were abandoned. Even more critically, a national police practice of political extermination resulted in widespread, quote, justifiable homicides, end quote, against Blacks who were victims of pre-dawn raids around the country. Even before the Nixon administration pressed such laws through Congress, police officials in various cities began to implement no-knock warrants, search and seizure policies, and preventative detention. Press intimidation was designed to ensure a minimum of disclosure of the most odious excesses. While authoritarians prefer the blessing of law to support their acts, they are generally prepared to proceed without them, and thus legal sanction lagged behind the actual police state tactics and genocidal conduct of the period. By the close of 1969, however, elected public officials were beginning to tackle the police state tactics in public forums. One of the first was Senator George McGovern, the South Dakota Democrat who chaired the Hunger Committee and belatedly sought the nomination of the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. It was a relatively early warning sounded on the 6th anniversary of the death of President Kennedy. But that McGovern speech on November 22nd, 1969 at the Brooke County Democratic Dinner in Bethany, West Virginia was a consummate indictment of the Nixon administration, which McGovern said relied on fear in a, quote, cruel campaign to stifle dissent, end quote, through confusion, polarization, and intimidation. McGovern said further, and I quote, hopefully, we have learned from history and are a better country, a wiser people for having suffered from these periods of repression. I think we are. I fear we will need to be in the days immediately ahead. The president may be keeping secret his plan for ending the war in Vietnam, but he has unveiled his plan for ending dissent in the United States. I sincerely believe that it is not possible to overestimate the sinister effects of the administration's campaign against the people's freedom of speech, assembly, and press. The effects of this campaign are far greater threat to liberty in this nation than any result, no matter how unfortunate, from the war in Vietnam could ever be. If the president and the vice president and the members of his cabinet and his staff do not turn away from this misconceived campaign, they will raise forces of repression that they will not be able to contain and that will ultimately earn for them a place in the dark shadows of American history. The pattern is becoming familiar. First, administration officials add to public confusion by uttering conflicting statements on issues. Vice President Agnew, for example, calls the organizers of a recent peace demonstration impudent snobs. Secretary of State Rogers terms them patriotic, if misguided, Americans. After the gathering, Attorney General Mitchell denounces them as violent, while Communications Director Klein praises their peacefulness. And this official confusion and contradiction has been the pattern on event after event. The second phase is equally predictable. It involves administration efforts to polarize public opinion on a given public question. The idea seems to be to isolate each group that holds a position in opposition to the administration. Those who disagree with the president are characterized as, quote, rotten apples or an effete corpse. A portrait is painted of a dangerous radical minority. Each group that opposes the president also somehow opposes a vast, quote, silent majority. This majority apparently agrees with the president on all issues. It's homogeneous. It has no complaints. But the administration is fond of reminding us that its silent legions can be dangerous. And that brings us to the third phase of the strategy, the intimidation stage. Having confused the American people through official contradiction about the right and wrong of an issue, having polarized and divided the American people and made citizens suspicious of one another, then the administration moves in to try to frighten and intimidate those opponents it feels it is isolated. The police powers of the state, the attorney general, the FCC, all are brought in play in threats, real and implied, on groups which are believed to be isolated and therefore vulnerable. There are many examples of this strategy in action, but none is more blatant and offensive than the recent speech by the Vice President of the United States, in which he assaulted Avril Harrisman and the television networks. I feel that the speech was perhaps the most frightening single statement ever to come from a high government official in my public career. During the McCarthy period, I always believed that he did not speak for the president, that he did not speak for President Eisenhower. But it is impossible to believe that Mr. Agnew, a vice president, does not speak for the president. The Agnew speech was carefully thought through and executed. This attack, led by the vice president, but it is abetted by federal agencies, ranging from the Federal Communications Commission to the Subversive Activities Control Board. They seek to intimidate the nation's free press into blind approval of the president's policies. They wish to make the press an arm of the administration, akin to the United States Information Agency, which just released a misleading film designed to show that the nation is not really divided on the war. Some have said that the vice president made some valid points about the concentration of power in television and newspapers, perhaps, but the president's motive for prompting him to make the speech had nothing to do with such legitimate criticism. That motive, pure and simple, was to intimidate the news media of the nation. In ancient times, the threat of a messenger who brought bad news was the loss of his head. In these more sophisticated times, the administration is invoking the threat of the loss of the license to broadcast. If the president should succeed in intimidating the men who comprise the eyes and ears of the American people into working of their government, and I am afraid the president has had some success already, then the nation is truly in for some hard times. For without their eyes and ears, the people will be blind and dumb at the mercy of any administration which wants to lead them around on a leash. End quote. McGovern's concerns with the Nixon administration's intimidation of the press was, of course, well-founded. It is axiomatic in the history of power seized by totalitarians that they must first bind to their will the media of expression between themselves and the people to be controlled. No tactic is more essential to despots than this. Perhaps the most obvious measure of the Nixon success at press intimidation during the first year in the White House was the result of the Vice President Spiro T. Agnew's first of several speeches attacking the press. That first attack came significantly on November 13, 1969, just 2 days before the massive Vietnam moratorium in which some 400,000 citizens came in the First Amendment tradition to petition their government. On November 15th, as the masses, unbelievable masses, swirled about the public grounds and federal edifices between the Capitol and the Washington Monument, the National Television Network cameras ground incessantly, as always, with two urgent exceptions. There was absolutely no live television coverage, such as was given the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom, the funerals of JFK, MLK, RFK, and former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Nixon's inaugural, nor even such it was given Agnew's speech attacking the press. Thus, the momentousness of the occasion was irrevocably lost. Coverage given on the evening television news programs was brief, and it concentrated not on the great mass of petitioners, but on several inconsequential skirmishes some demonstrators had with the police. Thus, even the historical significance of the protest was perverted. In the meantime, the president let it be known that the dissenters, no matter how many, how disciplined, no matter their message, would have no effect on him whatsoever. He spent the afternoon watching football on television. The networks, despite their lukewarm protests from their official caverns on Madison Avenue, simply had not made up their minds to oppose the Agnew message. They chose instead discretion as the better part of their valor. Senator McGovern is further correct in pointing out that the timing and such regulatory agencies as the FCC all play their part in the thinly veiled intimidation. The attack was keenly coordinated. It is persecution of the Black Panther Party. The Justice Department in the fall of 1969 subpoenaed the unpublished notes of reporters of Newsweek, the New York Times, CBS, and Time Life who had covered Panther activities. Newsweek was most resistant to the request, but subpoenas were eventually issued, for example, to Mike Wallace of CBS and Earl Caldwell of the New York Times. The negotiations went on for several months, but finally, the peak in pressure on Newsweek came, and the story of the pressure broke in the news media precisely on February 1st, 1970. The same day the license expired for the Post Newsweek television station in Miami. It cannot be immaterial that the Washington Post Company owns both Newsweek, whose notes were demanded, and the Miami station WLBW-TV, whose license was expiring. B. Dean Murch, Republican senator, Dean Birch, Republican Senator Barry Goldwater's campaign manager in 1964 presidential campaign, had just been named chairman of the FCC, and C, the group seeking the license in Miami, happened to be headed by W. Sloan McCrea, a Miami banker and partner of C.G. Robozo, a close friend of President Nixon's. Wow. All of this is not to say, of course, that the Washington Post Company was actually intimidated by these pressures, but there can be no doubt about the complicity within the Nixon administration to exert those pressures of intimidation. 5 months after WLBW TV license had expired, the FCC was still weighing the political ramifications of either renewing the license for Washington Post Company or awarding the license to personal friends of the President of the United States. On June 24, 1970, the FCC finally decided, with Chairman Birch and Commissioner Nicholas Johnson dissenting, to set the case for a hearing which purportedly would form the basis for an eventual FCC decision. However, a spokesman at the FCC indicated that the bureaucratic maneuvering could easily delay the hearing for as much as a year. In the meantime, there would be ample opportunity to test how much cooperation with the administration a television license in jeopardy and worth millions of dollars might be. During its first 2 years, the Nixon administration clearly exerted pressures in an attempt to commandeer and throttle news gathering and dissemination for and by the public. But it also moved with equal alacrity to increase its own storehouse of information on the private and personal lives of individual citizens. These moves occurred while the administration further tried to exercise control over the formal educational and intellectual machinery of the country. Just taking a break and get some water. At Indiana University, for example, activist students feel the weight of government-financed spying on campus by fellow students paid to do so under the guise of scholarship aid. Under the heading, quote, "Big Brother is looking," students claim at IU, Patrick Siddons reported for the Louisville Courier-Journal and Times, quote, "One of the students who has seen student activist people at the meetings he had conducted is Rob Saunders, chairman of the campus chapter of the Committee to End the War in Vietnam, a group now reorganized under new leadership with a new name. You become aware of surveillance," said Saunders, "when you talk to Thomas Schreck, the dean of students. He will tell you, no, we're not policing you, but we can't be at all the meetings at the same time, so we send others." "That sounds polite," Saunders says, "but it's surveillance. And then paranoia becomes truth and realism. We are being watched." To Saunders, there are two types of college students: the uninvolved student who does little except attend class, and the student activist. The former, he said, have an awareness of what they are supposed to do as citizens. They have not been exposed to varied and widespread opinions about anything. He says such a student comes to school for two things: to get an education and to go with girls. He blissfully allows the American dream of being a student. Such a student, says Saunders, is not paranoid. He believes the officer is his friend. It doesn't occur to him that an officer might enter his room, secretly drop a bag of marijuana on the floor, and then bust him for possession, end quote. In addition to the big brother pressure felt on the campuses, the so-called youth, Black and white, are convinced that the police establishment heralded concerns for drugs is strictly a tactic designed to make the country legally into a police state. This view was rather poignantly, if basely, put put by a writer in one of the plethora of underground newspapers which have sprung up with the rationale that the regular media are establishment oriented. Reported the Washington Free Press, quote, "Junk is the pig in our community. It is the man's weapon against us, disguised as a part of the underground. The biggest lie going on about heroin is that it will kill you, that it will do you harm as an individual, that it is a risk. That's crap. It will kill our community, our lifestyle, our revolution long before it will kill many single people. The police, the city, and federal governments, and Richard Nixon, the greatest priest pig, are all doing their damnedest to encourage the spread of heroin among us. If this seems fantastic, remember that it is common knowledge that the shit the cops confiscate and bust finds its way back onto the streets. There are lawyers with proof of this in their hands right now. The detectives and other pigs do not and could not sell dope so consistently without the knowledge of the chief of police. The little pigs do it for bread. The chief allows it for other reasons entirely. He acts under the orders of the federal government and is supposed to be implementing Nixon's push against quote unquote drug abuse. But if Nixon is trying to end the smack traffic, then why do the pigs only bust kids? Every time I'm arrested, one diddly shit thing or another, the cops who interrogate me brag that no major shipment of any dope comes in without their knowing it. Of course they are. Far too stupid for that to be true. But the syndicate and the cops are so chummy, one hand buys the other, that at least some of the big shipments must be common knowledge on the force. Yet they seldom hit the big man. And we know that they know who Mr. Big is, but they aren't about to bust him. This all means that Nixon and lesser officials are either bought off or have political reasons for wanting smack in our community. Probably both are true. The potential revolutionaries in the Black community, the street people, have been completely torn apart from within by heroin. Those who would have been the heaviest motherfuckers in town, instead of fighting cops or creating unrest, have been desperately killing and stealing from each other in order to feed their habits. This is how Harlem in New York City is controlled. This is how Watts and Philadelphia's Black areas are kept impotent. And this is part of the way that the Haight-Ashbury was changed from one of the finest places in the country to go and free yourself into a ghetto where in the first months of the year, there were 24 murders, many more deaths from disease, girls raped, and freaks beaten. The Height presented a real threat and was dealt with. Besides destroying a society from within, SMAC also provides the police with the best of special informants and agents, people from the community itself. A narcotics detective catches some strung out cat with dope on him, takes him into an office, gets all the names he can squeeze out of him, scares him to death, then lets him go, giving him a bag of skag for the road. The cat's had it. If he won't come across, he's busted. So he keeps giving names of people he doesn't like much. The cop has him set up deals, giving the kid and a string most of the dope from all the new busts. How many people have been busted with hundreds of dollars worth of dope on them, only to come into court and hear the cops say they just found enough for scientific analysis and conviction? This is not the first time in history that heroin or other opiates have been brought into a moving society in order to destroy it. The British did it to the Chinese during the last century. It is a myth that opium comes from China. England imported it from India and Turkey in order to string out the Chinese and bring them under control of the empire. The people there rebelled with the support of their empress and were defected in the quote opium wars. The Chinese people's resentment culminated in the Boxer Rebellion, which was crushed by 9 imperial powers, including the US. It wasn't until the early 1950s that the drug traffic was finally driven out of China by Mao Zedong. Recently, the CIA has been pushing grass in Cuba, hoping to open up new markets for smack by turning the people on first to the good shit, then to heroin. Nixon and his little old ladies are intentionally clouding the issue by acting, quote, holy, since they are helping the syndicate to push it. They want to misdirect us into thinking the danger is only to our bodies, when in fact, heroin destroys the spiritual vitality that exists between us. There is no reason to try smack and less reason to get strung out on it. People who try to get you to do it once are pigs, worse than uninformed kind in our community. They will keep us from freeing ourselves, and we do have to be together in order to do it. We can beat the skag dealers by not only refusing to score junk from them, but also by not scoring our grass, acid, or mesaline from them either. Don't buy anything from the cat who sells junk. Call him a pig. He's earned it and more. Freaks in Ann Arbor are already stomping their asses. Right on. End quote. During the last 5 years of the decade, the gruesome fears of students and others in the intellectual community became widely spread. Stated briefly, these fears reflected a rapidly declining confidence in the government to deal honestly and in the political system to provide remedies for societal ills. Moreover, many activist students in particular tended to fear and mistrust governmental motives. The distrust among white students was compounded among their Black counterparts. Together, Black and white students early in 1970 exhibited, among others, 2 basic pervasive fears. 1, the projected near total exclusion of Black students from traditional colleges and universities, accompanied by a white establishment takeover of traditionally Black colleges. And 2, the projected Nazification of all campuses, including the tactic of declaring, quote, emotionally ill any and all students and teachers who dare demonstrate in protest of such national policies as pursuing the wars in Southeast Asia and the repression of Black citizens. In the 3.5 centuries of Black oppression in America, education and training have been essential to the oppressor's ability to control, and the denial of them has been necessary to Black people's inability to defend themselves, even in nonviolent struggles. Thus, the Black campus and Black students play a unique role in the current effort for survival. Those elements in society still committed to Black enslavement, illiteracy, or death are employing massive energy, planning, and political acumen toward pacification, neutralization, or destruction of the Black colleges. The rationale is simple. Black colleges and Black students of white colleges have become an effective instrument for the development of Black liberation personnel and strategies. The Black campuses in particular have become sanctuaries of Black liberation. Thus, they had to be invaded, just as the sanctuaries in Cambodia required what President Nixon termed a cleaning out. Those who tried to prevent the true education of Black people during the century after the Civil War sought to make Black schools inadequate and irrelevant by requiring that Black schools be separate from white schools. Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute in 1881, and surely a widely misunderstood man, tried to warn America against that course. But whites in control assumed either that Dr. Washington was stupid or that if he happened to be right, they could prevent the failure he indicated. In one of his many epigrams, Dr. Washington warned, quote, You can't keep a man in a ditch without staying down there with him, end quote. Interpreted, this meant that whites could not keep Black schools from teaching and liberating Black children, could not deny them sanctuary unless whites were willing to stay in a Black school to guarantee its deprivation. This was much of the issue in the debates leading up to the Supreme Court's establishment of the, quote, separate but equal doctrine in 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The separate but equal doctrine was acceptable to controlling whites because they felt they could defeat the truism of Dr. Washington with one of two strategies. Thank you all for being in here. I'm so glad you all are listening. Make sure you like and share the video. Please like and share the video. And thanks for being here. First, instead of staying at the ditch, that is the Black school, whites would go off to run great universities and eventually to the moon and appoint instead a Black man to guard the ditch for them. This substitute guardian system worked effectively in many instances and over long periods of time, but it also failed just as often for Black campus sanctuaries to develop. The second scheme was simply to starve the Black schools financially and in all ways related to resources. They still doing that. Then, even if the substitute guardian fell asleep, turned his head, or attempted to help his Black brothers, he would lack the resources necessary to give that help. This scheme of denial also failed in ways imperceptible to the white controllers. Both schemes failed often enough to produce, for example, Thurgood Marshall and his colleagues, who revived the constitutional fights which culminated in the Brown decision of May 17, 1954, a reversal of the Plessy decision in 1896. In the meantime, Black schools also produced the Freedom Riders, the sit-inners, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and thousands of other bright and courageous young Black men and women who are determined to see that Black people are not illiterate, enslaved, or prematurely dead, except in the case of freedom and justice for themselves and their people. What then became the new scheme of those still committed to Black disadvantage and oppression? Their new scheme basically involved a reevaluation of Dr. Washington's truism. They decided that the Black educator had been right all along. To maintain control, the oppressor would have to return to the ditch, as it were. The new plan is either to extinguish or control Black institutions which have become so instrumental in the struggle for Black liberation. The new schemes included wiping out of funds for compensatory education, which have been helpful in establishing the Upward Bound programs under OEO and similar incentives for Black students. This was largely achieved in President Nixon's veto of the fiscal 1971 HEW appropriation, knocking out funds formerly used to bring Black students to the universities under special enrichment programs that assisted their academic success. The propaganda for these cutbacks was Vice President Agnew's attack during 1970 on the evils of open enrollment and his extolling some rights to education, which he said belonged to the natural aristocracy. Stringent new admission requirements, such as those affirmed for the University of Maryland by Maryland State Legislature in 1968, a C average or better, plus a ranking in the upper half of high school class for in-state, i.e. Baltimore students, for out-of-state students, i.e. Black students who commute from nearby Washington, D.C., a B average or better, plus ranking in the upper half of the high school class. Such scores and rankings, of course, fell well within the influence of establishmentarians who historically have discouraged Black academic achievement. Requirements secretly set in 1969 through 1970 by HEW that would force Black schools, even those maintained until recent years entirely without public support, to enroll white students up to 50% in order to get badly needed federal aid. Such a requirement automatically cuts by 50% the number of Black students normally served by those Black colleges. The HEW scheme was revealed by several dozen Black college presidents who attended a communication seminar in Atlanta, February 16, 1970. By early 1970, 10 state governors, all of them in states with outstanding Black colleges, had received letters from HEW signifying that desegregation of Black colleges must proceed more rapidly. Although the letters also called for desegregation of white colleges, Black college president of the Atlanta seminar said the desegregation pressure was being applied more strongly against them, and that HEW officials in their personal visits set 50% as the desegregation goal of the Black colleges. On August 6, 1969, HEW Civil Rights Director Leon A. Panetta explained to a group of returning Vietnam veterans, quote, "To date, we have requested desegregation plans from 5 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Mississippi, which will entail cooperative action between predominantly Black and predominantly white colleges to eliminate the racial identifiability of these institutions," end quote. The drastic raising of fees, such as was done at Indiana University in 1969, this is coupled with a projected raising of entrance scores at both white and Black colleges, a statistical reduction of Black students. HEW's further requirement that Black colleges hire white administrators to aid in the recruitment of white students, as one of the Black presidents at the Atlanta seminar stated, quote, "The white administrator would have to be of a caliber to replace the Black president when the time comes," end quote. This, they said, was a requirement verbally passed on to them by HEW civil rights representatives. Grand merging schemes, which placed Black schools under the domination of so-called university systems, a simple conversion to white control of what had been Black institutions, if indeed the Black schools remain open at all. On August 15, 1970, in a breakfast meeting with about 50 Black citizens of Montgomery County, Maryland, incumbent Governor Marvin Mandel and Secretary of State Blair Lee III explained how HEW had given them orders, as Lee put it, to, quote, "eliminate the racial identifiability of the colleges in Maryland." So ordered in January 1970, no compliance had been achieved because since whites make up about 80% of the state's population, quote, "if we made the college population conform with the population in the state, all the colleges would be white," declared Lee, a Democratic candidate to become lieutenant governor. Lee further explained the danger by indicating what would happen to mainly Black Morgan State College in Baltimore, which reverted from private to state control in 1939. Quote, "Morgan is a very good college, a monument to the Black academic community can do. I question whether we are doing any favors by making Morgan absolutely white," end quote. Governor Mandel, a Democratic candidate for re-election, after succeeding Vice President Agnew as Maryland governor, added that HEW officials had urged the all-Black Coppin Teachers College in Baltimore either be closed or merged with other schools, end quote. Little wonder then that on the day before August 14th, Howard University president Dr. James Cheek has said in an interview, quote, "The Black institutions are literally fighting for survival. The national policy is integration. The people understand integration and execute integration by closing Black institutions. That is the prime example of white racism," end quote. The move in 1970 by the Nixon administration to clear the way in court for federal government to give tax exemptions to white private and parochial schools, with a corresponding drop in public support for public schools where Black students are enrolled. These hastily drawn private schools came to be known in the South as, quote, segregation academies, a clear indication of their purpose. Such plans as that revealed in President Nixon's 1970 higher education message to Congress, plans which would begin to reduce Black aspiration to junior college or vocational school level. Reported Newsweek, quote, in a message to President Nixon last month, a group of Black junior college presidents expressed this anxiety. The natural aristocracy pronouncements of Vice President Agnew, together with your own emphasis on vocational training, strongly indicates that your administration views the community college as a ceiling for Black educational achievement, end quote. Within a span of 2 weeks in the spring of 1970, after President Nixon announced the expansion of the Indochina War with a U.S. invasion of Cambodia, scores of campuses flared up in protest, with National Guardsmen fatally shooting 4 white students at Kent State University in Ohio, and Mississippi policemen fatally shooting 2 Black students in front of a girls' dormitory at Jackson State College in Jackson, Mississippi. These actions had been punctuated by invectives against student demonstrators by President Nixon and Vice President Agnew, with the president himself calling student protesters, quote, bums, in the off-cuff remarks at the Pentagon. With the campuses virtually in open rebellion against the governor, President Nixon called in a group of 8 white university presidents for advice on May 7th, and following the meeting, appointed one of them, Dr. Alexander Hurd, Chancellor of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, to become a special emissary between the White House and the college campuses. Less than a week later, on the morning of May 13th, the Washington Post Marquise Childs wrote a column headline, quote, young anarchists increase risk of Nazi-style reaction in the US, end quote. In it, Childs drew the following parallel between the ascendancy of Nazism in Germany and the current unrest in the United States. Quote, in the early 30s, the weak Weimar Republic in post-World War I Germany was beset by a variety of ills. The communists were out to destroy this feeble government that had seen the middle class wiped out by erroneous inflation. They were aided and abetted by wild-out young revolutionaries who, in manner and dress, seemed to have been definitely hippie types before hippie and yippie came into vocabulary. You could hear them in their cellular rendezvous predicting the revolutionary they were about to bring on. But while they were boasting of what they would do on the barricades, the real revolution was being highly organized with the help of big money from German industrialists. Hitler and the Nazis were ready to take over. The young revolutionaries who did not flee the country were shortly in concentration camps or were tortured to death in Nazi prisons. No one would for a moment suggest that this is where we are today. Yet ominous signs make plain the polarization that is taking place in the deep currents of prejudice and hatred below the surface, end quote. Asked to comment on that portion of the child's column and whether, in fact, he saw parallels, Chancellor Hurd, a former political science professor, said, quote, I believe that there is obvious danger in the present situation with deepening and hardening disunity in the society, and in some instances among students themselves. The threats to intellectual freedom on campuses and in recent years come significantly from extremists who are unwilling to listen to the points of view with which they disagree. That is a serious condition present on some campuses now, And in times of turmoil, there is always the danger of an extreme reaction in authoritarian terms, end quote. But did the envisioned repressive laws being enacted against the campuses? I'm hoping not, Hurd said cautiously. I'm hoping not. Meanwhile, on May 14th, immediately following the fatal shootings in the back of 6 youthful Blacks by police in Augusta, Georgia, an urgent letter was sent to President Nixon from the head of a year-old coalition of presidents of 110 Black colleges. Dr. Herman Branson, then president of Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, Branson wrote the president, quote, "The National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education is much concerned over the recent happenings in some American colleges and universities and in Augusta as they affect Negro young people, their prospects, their attitudes, their safety, and their continued dedication to the ideals of our society. The association respectfully requests, therefore, an opportunity to present our concerns to you as soon as possible," end quote. At the same time, 2 other Black college presidents, Dr. Cheek of Howard, the largest Black university, and Dr. Hugh Gloster, head of Morehouse, whose alumni included the late Dr. King, were planning special all-campus programs devoted to the crisis of repression facing Black students. Dr. Shee also sent a letter to President Nixon supporting Dr. Branson's request for a meeting. These were the beginnings of a historic pronouncement to President Nixon and to the nations from Black colleges on the status of what they regarded as repression and genocide against Black Americans. On May 20th, President Nixon received 15 representatives of the Black college group in a meeting originally scheduled for 45 minutes. And it lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. Branson read to the president a statement protesting such long-standing conditions as manifestations of racism in all areas of American life, inadequate educational opportunities, widespread poverty and hunger, high unemployment rates among Blacks, and racial discrimination in employment, racial differentials in law enforcement procedures, and deplorable housing conditions. Just a minute. The statement directly criticized, quote, "the policies and practices of your own administration," end quote. And they told President Nixon that his, quote, "Southern strategy leads to the conclusion that Blacks are dispensable," end quote, and that your own failure to use your great moral influence to bring the people of this great nation together had contributed to the unrest and repression. What the Black educators told President Nixon had been a long time coming, but their views were not at all to persons attuned to the campuses in general and to the Black campuses in particular. For the most part, President Nixon sat and listened impassively to the Black educators, but at one point, when it seemed that the president should have shown some sympathy for their concerns, Dr. Hurd, who had helped arrange the meeting, broke in and said to President Nixon, quote, "What these colleges want is for the government to say, 'We are with you.' If this group cannot prevail and succeed, then we are lost," end quote. Dr. Hurd was not alone. Among white men who empathized with the Black educational problem, months earlier, Dr. John Monroe, who left the Harvard faculty in 1967 to become director of freshman studies at all-Black private Miles College in Birmingham. He said in an interview, "A college is more than a college if it is a Black college. People who are interested in racial order must support Black institutions." But in his meeting with the Black educators, President Nixon struck quite a different note. He inquired about the future of Black colleges and universities and asked whether they should not be absorbed by white universities. This infuriated the Black educators and further convince them of governmental schemes to take over Black schools. At a press conference following the meeting, Dr. Branson was asked to summarize President Nixon's reactions to their pleas. Branson did so by repeating the statement Attorney General John Mitchell had given a group of civil rights leaders at the beginning of the Nixon administration, quote, "Judge me by my deeds and not by my words," end quote. This summarization of the president's attitude received an unusual chorus of taunts from the 50 newsmen and women jammed tightly into the improvised press room at the Washington Hilton Hotel. "But haven't you already seen his deeds?" yelled reporters. "Isn't this where you came in? What's the news about that?" End quote. "You seem a lot less angry than Black students," a white reporter challenged Branson. Quote, "I've had a longer period of not showing my anger," quote, Branson shot back unseemingly. "I'm angry as anyone. If the anger and fear of top-level Black educators had ever been in doubt, it had come full evidence by the end of their meeting with President Nixon." Asked for his reaction to the meeting, Howard President Cheek said, quote, "The president heard from Black presidents on how we feel. It is important that it be known that we did not pull any punches," quote, end quote. Cheek said that he had told the president, quote, "about the direction in which the country is going, repression. We were respectful, but we were quite firm," end quote. Asked whether he thought there were deliberate designs against Blacks, Cheek responded, quote, "I do not think there is any deliberate sinister plan yet devised to repress or liquidate any segment of the population, but we are going into a period in which law and order are given priority at any price. I did not say that this is the policy of the president, but I do say that in the absence of vigorous advocacy to the contrary, this is the climate created," end quote. Although Dr. Cheek stopped just short of accusing the white establishments of systematic, deliberate repression and genocide, the charge was made directly only 1 week later in the joint statement of 4 Black private colleges in Atlanta. The 4 colleges, Morehouse, Clark, Morris Brown, and Spelman, which make up the Atlanta University system, issued what they called a, quote, "considered response to the continuing theme of violence and terror directed against Black people in the United States," end quote. Presented at a news conference, just a second. Okay. Presented at a news conference by Atlanta University, President Dr. Thomas D. Jarrett, the statement charged public comments, particularly by Vice President Agnew, with aiding and abetting the situation. Quote, "In the current era of systematic repression of Black people, police authorities are wantonly shooting down Black women, men, and children, while elected officials, both national and local, by their outrageously false and inflammatory public utterances, fans the fires of hatred and bigotry," end quote. This is still happening today, unfortunately. As the Christian Science Monitor observed in reporting the Atlanta statement, for a considered statement from an institution which is notable for the decorum of its staff and the students in the midst of racial turmoil, Lord have mercy. For the decorum of its staff and students in the midst of racial turmoils, the May 27th document contains quite bitter charges. The statement said in part, quote, "Events of recent months suggest that a rapid intensification of the violence and terror directed against Black people is occurring. Governmental authorities, nationally and locally, are using their powers to thwart the legitimate aspirations of Black people, and this is in turn precipitates greater violence directed against them, Blacks, by individuals and groups. In the face of an apparent incompatibility of Black aspirations for political and economic liberation and the maintenance of a capitalist system grounded in the doctrine of white supremacy, white governments and individuals have resorted to organized coercion to suppress the Black community. This is genocide. Victims of this oppression, however, wherever they may be, along with other men of goodwill, must join together to halt this brutal assault. Morehouse President Gloucester, whose students and faculty joined in the Atlanta statement, said that, quote, after the incidents at Augusta and Jackson, students on our campuses were angry, bitter, and frustrated, and they looked for ways to protect themselves, end quote. He took bitter exception to the idea of Black schools being absorbed by white ones. If they aren't integrated, he said of the Black schools, the fault is with white students and the white establishment. Custom and prejudice keeps whites out, not we, end quote. But Gloucester, whose college is one of only 4 Phi Beta Kappa colleges in Georgia, regardless of race, is aware of a strong new sentiment among Black students regarding their schools. Black students would not now welcome white students, he said. Despite that fact that 20 of Morehouse's 1,000 students then were white, I think it would be foolish for us to recruit white students now. Black students say they want these schools for themselves to make them an instrument for the development of Black people. And yet, that is a point of greater fear on the part of many Black students who have made a mission of keeping their schools Black. I came here, said Fisk University student body president William Owens, because all my life I had heard that this was a great college, the best. I figured that if it was the best, it would be doing something for Black people. It isn't. It's still trying to teach them to be white. All of its emphasis is on job security with none of the Black man need for power, end quote. It was the concern which drove Owens, the son of a North Carolina tobacco farmer, to lead a significant portion of the Fisk student body in revolt in the winter of 1965 to purge that sophisticated university in Nashville, rid it of whites, and make it a bastion of the Black liberation struggle. Founded in 1866 by the American Missionary Association and named for Union Army General Clifton B. Fisk, Fisk University is internationally famous and counts among its alumni some of the nation's most celebrated Black scholars, including the late Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, historian John Hope Franklin, and novelist Frank Yerby, C. Eric Lincoln, class of 54, and Cecil Eric Lincoln, class of 69, are father and son alumni who, writing in June 7, 1970, the New York Times magazine described the aborted attempt to make Fisk a Black university. Quote, in what the students called a week of reckoning that began on December 8, 1969, Owens, who was the president of the student government, led a demonstration to have Fisk converted into a Black university, which was defined as an institution structured, controlled, and administered by Black people, devoting itself to the cultural needs of the Black community, identifying all Black people as Africans, and that addressed itself completely to Black liberation. The demands on the Fisk administration included, quote, the removal of all white departmental and administrative heads, end quote, and the severance of ties with white institutions and foundations not in sympathy with the notion of a Black university. The lack of success of the venture was no measure of the sincerity of the mission. Seeing the establishment and preservation of Black universities as related to Black survival, Owens and others continued the effort. He subsequently became president of the student government in exile, carrying on his efforts from an off-campus apartment. Such behavior and determination by Owens at Fisk and by his white allies around the country were closely studied in Washington by both the lawmaking and law enforcement establishments. During 1969, the shouts for law and order on the nation's campuses came largely in response to the white student rebellion against the country's two ongoing wars, the war against Browns and Asians and the war against Blacks in America. White students raised disturbances on virtually every sizable campus, pitting their bodies against police lines set up to protect Dow Chemical and CIA recruiters against compulsory and academically credited ROTC programs. They also protested the draft and provided the bulk of the war protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in the summer of 1968, and at the massive Vietnam moratorium march in Washington in mid-November 1969. Although there were hurried bills thrown into the hoppers, both in the state legislatures across the country and in Congress, white college administrators did not crack down on students hard enough and took umbrage at the police helicopters' raids over Berkeley, for example. The feeling against our own children, as congressmen and colonists began lamenting, was running so high that some members of Congress who were self-proclaimed friends of students and education began to respond with bids for repressive measures. Most notable in this latter group was the former Oregon school mom, Mrs. Edith Green, a spirited Democratic member of the House Education and Labor Committee, which has legislative jurisdiction over the HEW's Office of Education. Mrs. Green, during the 90th Congress, proposed several measures aimed essentially at cutting off scholarship aid to students who demonstrated illegally, and eventually the cutting off of aid to the college itself if it failed to deal promptly and harshly with such students. She let it be known that her education constituents, some of her colleagues, and some reporters that she regarded her proposed measures mere pablum compared to the measures that Congress was likely to enact if campus disruptions continued. She said, in fact, that her measures, if enacted, stood a chance of staving off the more repressive measures while helping restore order on campus. Through weeks of these debates, it seemed impossible that measures more repressive than those already introduced might, in fact, be in the offing. However, on February 3rd, 1969, an ominous picture began to take shape with the testimony of Dr. S.I. Hagawa, the senator of San Francisco State College, before Mrs. Green's Special Subcommittee on Education. Dr. Hagawa, who had just been appointed acting president of the college, was one of a parade of witnesses called before the subcommittee. But it was his appearance that first attracted standing room only crowds of students and initiated new fears of repression. The new view began to fall into focus in this exchange between Hagawa and Representative Roman Puzinski, a Chicago Democrat and member of the subcommittee. Quote, Puzinski says, and I quote, "I want to congratulate you, Doctor, for your excellent testimony this morning. Over the weekend, one of your former colleagues, Dr. Bruno Bellingham, who is recognized all over the world as an outstanding educator and psychologist, said that, quote, student demonstrators are sick and in need of psychiatric treatment, end quote. I am reading from the Chicago Tribune. Professor Botenheim, who was in Germany during the 1930s and the rise of Adolf Hitler and fascism, said the demonstrations at the U of C, University of Chicago, remind him of student unrest in that country. I saw the same thing in German universities, which spearheaded the fascist government, which led to the rule of Hitler," he said. More disturbing than the minorities who are trying to take over the universities is the attitude of the nation which promotes it. Would you agree with Dr. Boltheim that a lot of these young people are sick and in need of psychiatric attention? Hakawa says, Dr. Boltheim is a psychiatrist and he is better able than I am to diagnose actual illness. If I were to say they are sick, it would simply be calling them names. I haven't got the scientific background to say that. Pozinski, quote, Dr. Boltenheim also said that some of the demonstrators are paranoics, but he said that there are no more paranoics around them than before, but now the mass media gives them more attention. Have you had any experience with that sort of phenomenon? Hakawa says, well, perhaps that is right. I keep maintaining that the mass media, especially television, is a branch of show business, and one of the functions of their news programs, in addition to informing, is to entertain and attract attention. Maybe paranoics are more interesting as television material than the rest of us. Paninsky, I have a high regard for Dr. Boltenheim, and I think we can all agree he is a world-renowned expert. He said the leaders of the demonstrators are very rational people who are trying to foment revolution. They use the mass of irrational students to gain this end, he said. What they want is Maoism, nihilism, and anarchy. He said he hoped that the university administration will not try to use force to clear the six-story administration building of the protesters who have taken it over and held it since Thursday at noon. I don't believe in violence and I don't want to make martyrs out of anyone, he said. This, of course, raises some serious questions. If indeed we had been treating those demonstrations as an act of a group of young people who are practicing dissent and ignoring the fact that they are probably or do have in the midst people need some psychiatric attention, perhaps we ought to start giving some thought to providing either funds for behavior clinics or in some way getting at this whole picture of mental health. I have often felt that this is a problem. Now, what do you think? Hakawa states, I don't know to what degree colleges should be responsible for the mental health of their students. We obviously have student health clinics and counselor services which have something to do with mental health problems, but how can you, in a situation like this, diagnose individuals out of a picket line and say you need mental health therapy, but this one doesn't? How do you do this? Paninsky says, years ago, it was a common practice for judges when somebody came before them for violation of the law, and if there was some reason to believe that this person was suffering from some form of emotional disturbance, the judge, before imposing sentence, would first assign the defendant to a behavior clinic, and the report would be made to the judge, who then could very intelligently approach the subject. Obviously, if the person was emotionally disturbed, you are not going to treat him as a criminal. You are going to treat him as a sick person and try to provide some help for him. Now, I am wondering how many of these young students who participate in these riots have ever been subjected to a behavioral clinic study. Hakawa says, I don't know, but an awful lot of them look as if they needed it. Whereas Dr. Hakawa, the semanticist, was willingly but short on credentials for building a case of emotional sickness among the student protesters. Dr. Boltenheim's enthusiasm and psychiatric credentials were made to order. Pozinski asked for and received a unanimous consent of the subcommittee to hear the testimony of Dr. Boltenheim, who appeared before the subcommittee on March 20th, 1969. In a brilliantly designed paper, Dr. Boltenheim told an impressed subcommittee, quote, now, of course, history does not repeat itself. There are vast differences, but nevertheless, some of the similarities between the two situations are very striking. The German student rebels were of extreme right, where are presently Is that light, is a thing behind the couch is messed up or something? I noticed the light was out. Behind the couch, the lamp. Oh, okay. Can you plug it back in, you mind? Sorry about that. Let's see. There we go. Let me finish reading. In Germany, the philosophy which gained a mass following was racist and directed against and discriminated against minority, the Jews, while here the radical students intend to help a discriminated minority, which is an important difference. But it does not change the parallels that universities were forced to make decisions in respect to the race of students and professors rather than on the basis of disregard of any racial origin. For example, the German universities began to cave in when students coerced the faculties to appoint professorships in race sciences. That is, professorships teaching the special aspects, merits, achievements of one race versus another, rather than concentrating in their teaching on contributions to knowledge, whatever the origin of the person who made the contribution. In my opinion, there are today far too many students in the college who essentially have no business to be there. Some are there to evade the draft, many others out of vague idea that it will help them to find better paying jobs, though they do not know what jobs they really want. And again, all too many go to college because they do not know what better to do and because society and the schools expect it of them. Their deep dissatisfaction with themselves and their inner confusion is projected against the institution of the college first and against all institutions of society secondarily, which are blamed for their own inner weaknesses. I think many of the rebellious students are essentially guilt-ridden individuals too. They feel terribly guilty about all the advantages they have. And there is also the guilt of their exemption from the draft, which I believe is a serious guilt. They cannot bear to live with this guilt, so they try to destroy society or certain of its institutions rather than live with their own inner guilt because they have it so good. It is their hatred of society that makes it so easy for the small group of militant leaders to make common cause with another small group that provides temporary leadership for some of the rebellions. These latter are outright paranoid individuals. I do not believe the number of paranoids among students is greater than their number would be in any comparable group of the population. They become dangerous again because of their high intelligence, which permits them to hide more successfully the degree of their disturbance from the non-experts. Having worked professionally with some of them for years, I know that student revolt permits them to act out their paranoia to a degree that no other position in society would permit them. How understandable then that all paranoids who can do flock into the ranks of these militants. Unfortunately, most non-experts do not know how persuasive paranoids can be, at least for a time until they are recognized as such. The persuasiveness of Hitler and a Stalin is now recognized as the consequence of their own paranoia and their unconscious appeal to the vague paranoid tendencies that can be found among the immature and disgruntled. I have no doubt that the ranks of militants contain some would-be Hitlers and Stalins, hence again, their dangerousness. Thus, being one of the faculty, I believe efforts should be concentrated on strengthening the will of colleges and universities to resist disruption and coercion. If we succeed in doing so, I believe we should have little need to take recourse to punitive measures. Beyond setting into practice that those who do wish to have no part of our universities should have their will. They should not be permitted to be live and work at a place that they hate, not as a punishment, I believe, but because to remain at a place they hate and despise serves no purpose and is detrimental to their emotional well-being. End quote. Now, I don't know how y'all interpreted that, but it sounds like they pathologized rebellion. They tried to pathologize rebellion, which in my mind was warranted because of all the repressive tactics that had been taking place. But this is also historically consistent that you've seen while they're doing this to white and black students in this particular case. If you go back and look at the history of psychiatry, it is very racist and anti-black. So this is in line with this man. Anyway, the sum total of Dr. Boatman's contribution was to show student dissenters as the real motors of Nazification of America, as being emotionally sick in a way that requires their being put away to protect society and the student dissenters. And finally, he lectured Congress on its responsibility to deal with these young neo-Nazis, as it were. When Dr. Botenheim had finished, Pozinski was exculling. He sat back in his chair and savored the moment while Dr. Bockheim treated reporters and others swarming about him to some additional comments. Pozinski let the other admirers have at the guest for a time. Then he came down and rescued the clean-headed psychiatrist, and escorted him to an elevator, literally massaging him in praise and thanks. Back in his office, Pozinski, a former news reporter in Chicago, was delighted that a working newsman, the author, wanted a copy of the Tribune article and had shown a genuine interest in Dr. Botenheim. And what he really had in mind, and why it was so important to him to have Dr. Botenheim's testimony, Pozinski was glad to respond. Quote, "You know," he said with an appreciative gleam in his eyes, "you're the first reporter to ask me that. So come on in and I'll tell you." Entering his inner sanctum and having instructed his secretary for a few undisturbed minutes, he closed the door and splashed down in a big, soft, high-backed chair behind his desk. Quote, "You see," he explained, "this is very serious. And that's why I'm glad you asked me about this. I'm not going against the students, you understand. I'm for them and the rest of the people too. I just think many of them are sick and need help. You know," he went on, holding up his hand to stop a question, "I actually sympathize with the young people today. I do. They are under an awful lot of pressure, more pressure than we ever face. Look at it. They are concerned with the draft, but also with the pressures of education in a highly competitive society. Making the grades alone is a tough deal for a kid in those good schools today. They've just got all kinds of pressures of today's society, and I'm not really surprised that some of them crack up. A lot of them really are cracked, you know." "Perhaps," the reporter granted, "but these hearings are supposed to result in some kind of legislation. What have you got in mind?" He held up his hand again, this time to delay that question for a moment more. "Now just think about it," he said. You take just another day. You take just the other day, I saw that some of those kids were going around on the street buck naked. Now," he gave an exasperated laugh, "you know that you've got to be sick and they need help for their own good as well as the good of others." "So what do you plan to do?" he was asked. "Well, I'll tell you," he said in a newly confidential tone. "I'm going to introduce a bill that will put this in the hands of the proper people, the courts, and the mental institutions." Pozinski went on to explain that his bill will provide new funds to pay for a psychiatrist on each campus, a person competent to the judge and the sanctity of the protesters upon concurrence of a court judge. Such persons would be put away until they can think straight. But the reporter could phrase another question. Pozinski rose from his chair and walked from behind the desk, giving additional emphasis to his next point. Now, I don't blame these poor kids for all their trouble, he said. You see, as witnesses have told the subcommittee, a lot of this wouldn't go on if the kids weren't encouraged by their teachers, their own teachers. So my bill would not cover just the illness of the kids. It would also cover any teachers who either encouraged them or who didn't exercise reasonable authority in discouraging them. When would his bill be introduced, and how much support do you expect to get? Pawzinski held back on his piece of strategy, but he hinted that he would first give the subcommittee chairman, Mrs. Green, a chance to have her bill passed, and that its passage might even make his bill's chances better. As for support, he smiled with a wink and indicated that he would have the votes when the time came. Mrs. Green's bill was staunchly opposed in the full Education and Labor Committee and was beaten back in a tricky maneuver that sought passage on the floor of the House without committee approval. Pawzinski's bill was not introduced at all during the 91st Congress, 1969 to 1970. President Nixon vetoed the $20 billion HEW appropriation in January 1970. The official reason was that the president opposed a $4 billion portion designated for impacted aid money paid to communities, many of them rich, such as Montgomery County, Maryland, and Fairfax County, Virginia, where federal employees live and or work. With considerable merit, the White House argued that a cutback in such funds would end an inequity against poor communities. But some critics of the veto saw it as a move by the president to put his stamp on the nation's education system. One disgruntled but well-informed source high in the Office of Education explained that the administration's withholding of funds from schools would bring state and local education officers and college administrators begging at the door of the administration, asking what they could do to get their funds restored. Interesting. At that point, the source said, the administration will state its price, and the price will be steep. The price, he said, would include lobbying support for passage for such bills as college officials had opposed, but which Pawzinski and others favored. Added the source, caught in a serious financial dilemma, the educational bureaucracy would be forced to give at least tacit approval. One final point, the source said, Education Commissioner Jim Allen is not the kind of guy to want to do this, so he won't be around when things start getting tough. End quote. As the source predicted, by mid-year 1970, things had begun to get rough. The Liberal Education Commissioner James E. Allen Jr. was fired on June 10th for his outspoken opposition to Nixon administration policies on the war in Indochina and education back home. In mid-August, President Nixon vetoed the $4.4 billion appropriation for the U.S. Office of Education. And although Congress later overrode the veto, such policies were already being felt down in the education bureaucracy. On the day following the veto, Presidents Lloyd H. Elliott and Robert J. Hennell of George Washington and Georgetown University, respectively, told the House District Committee that their medical schools would either have to close or be offered to the federal government unless they receive emergency financial support. During the 1969 hearings before the Special Subcommittee on Education, Robert S. Powell, Jr., president of the U.S. National Student Association, had tried to dissuade Congress and the federal government generally from giving in to fear, legislation, and repression, and further pointed to the basis for the white student fears in defense of their Black counterparts. Quote, "Let me begin by saying I am acutely aware of the position that I am in, and of the repressive sentiment that you and others, congressmen and senators, receive daily in your mail. I can appreciate the pressures that your representative positions put you in as you attempt to respond to strong constituent pressures to crack down on student dissent. Understandably, Public officials, young members of Congress, have frequently reacted to recent events on campus out of fear. I hope this morning to put your fear in perspective so that this and other public bodies might respond constructively to the very serious problems higher education is confronting today. If you will learn from turmoil on campus, you should understand that millions of middle class youth who have shared rather richly in our touted affluence not only do not prize it, but in fact consider it a positive handicap in search for personal development and national integrity. And you should understand that the Black and brown population of this generation of American youth, who, because of the operational racism of our economic, political, and educational institutions, have been systemically denied any of the benefits of our higher education, are angry because they have been frauded, cheated, and ignored by those who make higher education policy. The only doors that open to even a small percentage of Black and brown students led them to grossly inadequate, white-dominated, segregated educational facilities such as Black college system in the South, and they are now saying in long overdue tones of anger that we must do better. The war in Vietnam goes on, and the universities continue to comply mindlessly with it in every possible aspect: research, recruitment, training, and cooperation with the draft. The Black man in America still struggles to be free, yet the university still chooses to be a part of the problem. With its indifference and lack of commitment, rather than choosing to be a part of the solution, which it could so courageously choose to be, let me be frankly clear that the challenge will not be diminished by attempts to suppress us with punitive measures. Pleas for law and order serve only to deepen the growing division that immobilize us and can never replace a working commitment for change on the silence those who are bringing it to your attention. As I emphasized at the outset, the student revolt now sweeping our campuses is an indication of a deep and severe crisis in American higher education, bound to so many of the tragic injustices and inequities in our national life. That crisis will not go away, even if you manage to silence those who are bringing it to your attention. End quote. In the spring of 1969, a number of students at Missouri's mainly Black Lincoln University at Jefferson City presented a list of demands to the university administration. We demand that all dormitories be exterminated more frequently, more frequent checks and repairs of washrooms and related facilities, no intimidation of athletes for chosen hairstyles, and extension of practice hours for music students in the fine arts building. Almost instantly, dozens of armed and helmeted guards descended on the Union building. Students not involved in the sit-in became frightened and angered at the storming by police. Interference ensued. Students were beaten, fires broke out, reported sniping followed, arrests were made. In a front-page editorial, quote, "Madness in Missouri," the St. Louis Sentinel warned, quote, "We see America today in the same posture as Germany stood in the early 30s. Its social ills at the time gave impetus to extreme dissenters. This resulted in a counter mood of middle-class resistance and the ultimate development of a repressive society. A society under Hitler stifled all dissent and contained in a vice-like grip the revolutionaries as well as the comfortable middle-classers who suffered it to happen. It is because we drift towards this dreadful possibility that it behooves these idealistic young minds in their quest for a utopian world to ponder as they reach a point of tolerance. The American people were already gripped in a police vice far tighter than most would believe. For example, Barring some rare snafu back at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., a dossier was promptly filed on every Lincoln student identified in any way with the sit-in. Those dossiers became a part of massive computerized file, a pickup list covering individuals in 150 cities throughout the nation. In the event of a general domestic crisis, giant computers would spit out the names such persons to be picked up and detained or otherwise handled in a manner that is among the best kept secrets of the Pentagon. This new Pentagon facility was ordered set up within a month after President Nixon's inauguration. At a cost of $2.7 million, it has its closest parallel the logistical arrangement for the Strategic Air Command, whose responsibility it is to retaliate, destroy a foreign enemy should the United States ever be attacked from the outside. It is both shocking and significant that, with the rarest exception, the establishment of this, quote, domestic crisis facility raised few eyebrows, and there was no public protest, no outcry, whatsoever when it was routinely reported in 1969. One of the more complete reports was this one in July 9, 1969 issue of the New York Times. Quote, the United States Army opened to newsmen today a $2.7 million operations center built beneath a Pentagon parking lot. The center contains 40,000 square feet of space and is topped by the 5 feet of earth, fill, concrete, and asphalt. It is directly under the Pentagon Mall, whereas 100,000 peace marchers demonstrated in 1967. The structure was converted from a storage area to provide greater space for soldiers and civilians who work in the crisis management headquarters. Work has been underway since February, Army spokesman said, and is still not complete. During the transition stage, the old operations center on the Pentagon's second level will continue to carry out some functions. 3 other military services maintain facilities that are alike in purpose. In addition, the Pentagon houses a joint operations center for all military services. The new Army facility consists of 2 rooms for computers and computer processors, a high-ceiling situation room whose walls are lined with maps and screens, and a control room that is the heart of the Army's worldwide communications network. A telephone booth that provides a, quote, safe link to the White House stands in the corner. A glass-enclosed, quote, command balcony, end quote, has been set up for military commanders. From this second-level area, they can watch the development of a crisis as it unfolds on the maps across the room. The balcony is designed to monitor the center's activities. Computer data can be fed into the 4 screens in the situation room, and they can be used to brief military commanders in the viewing balcony. The computers are fed from a mass storage drum that contains 130 million characters or bits of information. The ability to gather and transmit all this information rapidly is a key to the successful function of the center. If computer operations are overloaded, a backup system is used for partial secondary support. An Army spokesman called this a fail-safe system because it means we don't fail completely. The facility includes the Pentagon's Civil Disturbance Directorate, which is the command center of federal involvement in the monitoring or control of riots. An Army spokesman said, quote, information packets, end quote, were available on 150 cities across the country that may have disorders. The directorate is prepared, he said, to monitor up to 25 such disturbances simultaneously and to direct federal support to law enforcement agencies if ordered by the president. The packets contain vital information on the cities. They were selected because they have a, quote, history of possible disturbances occurring in them, end quote, according to the Army. No police state would be complete without surveillance, tenacious surveillance to the point of prying into the far recesses of the personal lives of its subjects. Technology and intensity are the ingredients added to the U.S. police establishment's domestic spying, which hastened the imminence of a police state by 1970. That's 50 years ago. Can you imagine how much more sophisticated it is now? Woo! It's much more sophisticated now. You better believe it. On June 28, 1970, the New York Times carried a lengthy page-one story out of Washington by Ben A. Franklin, detailing some of the ways in which this computer technology was already being used and what little was being done to counter it. Quote, the police, security, and military intelligence agencies of the federal government are quietly compiling a mass of computerized microfilm files here on hundreds of thousands of law-abiding yet suspect Americans. The leader of a Negro protest against welfare regulations in St. Louis, for example, is the subject of a teletype spot report to Washington shared by as many as half a dozen government intelligence gathering groups. The name of a college professor who finds himself unwittingly, even innocently, arrested for disorderly conduct in a police roundup at a peace rally in San Francisco goes into the data file. A student fight in an Alabama high school is recorded if it is interracial. Government officials insist that the information is needed and is handled discreetly to protect the innocent, the minor offender, and the repentant. The critics, including the Washington chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union and Representative Cornelius E. Gallagher, Democrat of New Jersey, charged that the system is an invasion of privacy and a potential infringement of First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly. Senator Ervin, a conservative, a student of the Constitution, a former judge of North Carolina Supreme Court, and the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, says that the advent of computer technology and government file keeping is pushing the country toward a, quote, mass surveillance system unprecedented in American history, end quote. You don't say. In a recent series of Senate speeches, Mr. Ervin said that the danger was being masked by a failure of Americans to understand, quote, the computer mystique, end quote, and by the undoubted sincerity and desire for efficiency of the data bank operators and planners. The government is gathering information on its citizens at the following places: a Secret Service computer, one of the newest and most sophisticated in government, in its memory, the names and dossiers of activists, malcontents, persistent seekers of redress, and those who, quote, embarrass the president or other government leaders are filed with those of potential assassins and persons convicted of threats against the president. A data bank compiled by the Justice Department Civil Disturbance Group, it produces a weekly printout of national tension points on racial, class, and political issues and the individuals and groups involved in them. Intelligence on peace rallies, welfare protests, and the like provide the database against which the computer measures the mood of the nation and the militancy of its citizens. Judgments are made, subjects are listed as radical or moderate. A huge file of microfilm intelligence reports, clippings, and other materials on civilian activity maintained by the Army's Counterintelligence Analysis Division in Alexandria, Virginia. Its purpose is to help prepare deployment estimates for troop commands on alert to respond to civil disturbances in 25 American cities. Army intelligence was ordered earlier this year to destroy a large data bank and to stop assigning agents to penetrate peace groups and civil rights organizations. But complaints persist that both are being continued. Civilian officials of the Army say they assume they are not. The Warren Commission on the riots legitimized procedures which, I grant you, would have been unthinkable and frankly unattainable from Congress in a different climate, one official said. There are obvious questions and dangers in what we are doing, but I think events have shown it is legitimate. The official declined to be quoted by name. Senator Ervin contends that in the total recall, the permanence, the speed, and the interconnection of government data files there rests a potential for control and intimidation that is alien to our form of government and foreign to a society of free men. The integration of data banks, mixing criminal with non-criminal files, is already underway, according to his subcommittee. Although he was generally ignored, both by the press and individual citizens, Senator Ervin has repeatedly protested the nation's abdication of individual rights to privacy. He was a rare outcry. In a speech before the Senate on November 10, 1969, Senator Ervin listed a number of what he regarded as unconstitutional abuses of power. Wow, crazy. And the computer invasion of individual privacy, with the entire federal establishment becoming infested with spying responsibilities. At one point, Senator Ervin told his colleagues, and I quote, "The Social Security number once was treated as a private matter, sacred to the individual. That was in the 1930s, before the computer age. Now, with this number on almost every government form and every private questionnaire, no man can be lost. And this is reassuring, but similarly, no man can ever again be alone." And this is despairing. The new plan of the Health, Education, and Welfare Department to tie in a national welfare program to the Social Security system raises spectators of surveillance and privacy invasion on a scale never before experienced. Only time will tell what the bureaucrats will do with this. Sadly enough, it will be the poor, the sick, the unsophisticated, the inexperienced who will have to fight the computers in this program. It is not just a chance of wrong or one-sided information being fed into vast government and private computer systems that should give us cause to worry. The increase of computers makes it cheaper and vastly more simple for government as well as private businesses to collect and store information on people for reasons they would give us serious pause. There is, for instance, the Secret Service's well-meaning program to keep track of people who might harm the president or other public officials. But consider this Secret Service memorandum telling employees of federal agencies to supply information about individuals who make oral or written statements about high government officials in the following categories: threatening statements, irrational statements, and abusive statements. Information on professional gate crashers, information on persons who insist upon personally contacting high government officials for the purpose of redress of imaginary grievances, and so forth. Information pertaining to a threat, plan, or attempt by an individual, a group, or an organization to physically harm or embarrass the persons protected by the U.S. Secret Service or any other high U.S. government official at home or abroad. Many people with complete faith in their government believe that the place to start with a complaint is with the president or vice president. Yet some of these people who write a strong letter will never know they've been fed into yet another government data system. Are these records now to be a part of standard employment checks for suitable and security clearances? End quote. Senator Ervin's further concerns about the 1970 census, while phrased more gently, were supportive of the concerns of the Black militant at Indiana University who saw the most ominous motives in the police state crime. The suspicious militant felt sure that the excessive and otherwise extraneous data collected would be used to guide police in their pre-dawn raids and guerrilla wars against the Black ghetto. On the floor of the Senate, Senator Ervin continued, quote, "It has been estimated that by 1970, the total statistical budget of the federal government will probably exceed 200 million. If complaints to Congress are any indication that the impact on individual rights of these programs is proving devastating, the decennial census questionnaire with civil and criminal penalties, and in one example of this, with such questions as how much rent do you pay? Do you live in a one-family house? Do you use gas? If a woman, how many babies have you had, not counting stillbirth? How much did you earn in 1967? If married more than once, how did your first marriage end? Do you have a clothes dryer? Do you have a telephone? If so, what is the number? Do you have a home food freezer? Do you own a second home? Does your TV set have a UHF? Do you have a flush toilet? Do you have a bathtub or shower? That's crazy. They actually had that on the census? Lord have mercy. Another example of this computer prying occurred last spring when the Constitutional Rights Subcommittee began receiving complaints from elderly, disabled, or retired people in all walks of life about a 15-page form sent out by the Census Bureau. It asks questions such as, what have you been doing in the last 4 weeks to find work? Taking things all together, would you say you are very happy, pretty happy, or not happy these days? Do you have artificial dentures? Do you or your spouse see or telephone your parents as often as once a week? What is the total number of gifts that you give to individuals per year? How many different newspapers do you receive and buy regularly? About how often do you go to the barbershop or beauty salon? What were you doing most of last week? No wonder why Black people don't like filling out the census. End quote. Why does a federal, that was my comment. No wonder why Black people like filling out the census. Anyway, let me finish. Why does a federal computer need to know whether you live in a single family dwelling or an apartment? And what difference does it make whether you get cold by turning off the gas or the electricity? Plenty. Census officials explained a few months ago, before the 1970 forms went out, that there would be 3 different forms to be filled out by different groups of citizens. A so-called random sample of 20% saw the most complete data of all, such as whether you normally entered your dwelling by front, side, or rear door. This random percentage also happened to be approximately the percentage of collective non-white minorities in the nation. The 80% form contained only 28 questions, while the random form, sent heavily to ghettos and to Blacks wherever they live, contained roughly 80 questions. Even without the 1970 data, the nation's omnipresent police web already had established the penalment and surveillance even on the private and legal activities of individual Americans. Writing in the January 1970 issue of the Washington Monthly, Christopher Pyle, a former captain in the Army intelligence, reported copiously on the Army's establishment of a national computerized data bank. Pyle says, for the past 4 years, the U.S. Army has been closely watching civilian political activity within the United States. Nearly 1,000 plainclothes investigators working out of some 300 offices from coast to coast keep track of political protests of all kinds, from Klan rallies in North Carolina to anti-war speeches at Harvard. This aspect of their duties is unknown to most Americans. They know these soldier agents, if at all, only as personable young men whose principal function is to conduct background investigations of persons being considered for security clearances. When this program began in the summer of 1965, its purpose was to provide early warning of civil disorders which the Army might be called upon to quell. In the summer of 1967, however, its scope widened to include the political beliefs and actions of individuals and organizations active in the civil rights, white supremacy, Black power, and anti-war movements. Today, the Army maintains files on the membership, ideology, programs, and practices of virtually every activist political group in the country. Damn, this was in 67. These include not only such violence-prone organizations as the Minutemen and the Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM, but such nonviolent groups as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Clergy and Laymen United Against the War in Vietnam, and American Civil Liberties Union, Women's Strike for Peace, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Army obtains most of its information about protest politics and the files of municipal and state police departments and of the FBI. In addition, its agents subscribe to hundreds of local and campus newspapers, monitor police and FBI radio broadcasts, and on occasion conduct their own undercover operations. Military undercover agents have posed as press photographers covering anti-war demonstrations, as students on college campuses, and as residents of Resurrection City. They have even recruited civilians into their service, sometimes to pay, but more often through appeals to patriotism. For example, when Columbia University gave its students the option of closing their academic records to routine inspection by government investigators, the 180th Military Intelligence Group in Manhattan quietly persuaded an employee of the registrar's office to disclose information from the closed files on the sly. That's crazy. To assure prompt communication of these reports, the Army distributes them over a nationwide wire service. Completed in the fall of 1967, this teletype network gives every major troop command in the United States daily and weekly reports on virtually all political protests occurring anywhere in the nation. Because the Investigative Records Repository is one of the federal government's main libraries for security clearance information, access to its personality files is not limited to Army officials. Other federal agencies now drawing on its memory banks include the FBI, the Secret Service, the Passport Office, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Civil Service Commission, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Navy, and the Air Force. In short, the personality files are likely to be made available to any federal agency that issues security clearances, conducts investigations, or enforces laws. Daily recipients of this raw intelligence include all of the Army's military intelligence groups within the United States, riot control units on standby alert, and the Army Operations Center at the Pentagon. The Operations Center, sometimes called the Domestic War Room, is a green carpeted suite of connecting offices, conference rooms, and cubicles from which Army and Defense Department officials dispatch and coordinate troops that deal with riots, earthquakes, and other disasters. There is no question that the Army must have domestic intelligence. In order to assist civilian authorities, it needs maps and descriptions of potential riot or disaster areas, as well as early warning of incidents likely to provoke mass violence. The Army needs this kind of information so that it can fulfill long-established legitimate responsibilities. But must it also distribute and store detailed reports on the political beliefs and actions of individuals and groups? Officials of the Intelligence Command believe that they must, without detailed knowledge of community infrastructure, they argue, riot control troops would not be able to enforce curfews or quell violence. To support this contention, they cite the usefulness of personality files and blacklists in breaking up guerrilla organizations in Malaya and South Vietnam. One early proponent of this view was the Army's Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence during 1967 through 1968, Major General William P. Yarborough. At the height of the Detroit riots of 1967, he instructed his staff in the domestic war room, quote, "Men, get out of your counterinsurgency manuals. We have an insurgency on our hands," end quote. Of course, they did not. And one war room officer who attempted to carry out the general's order later observed, there we were, plotting power plants, radio stations, and armories on the situation maps when we should have been locating the liquor and color television stores instead. A year later, National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders reached a similar conclusion about the motives of ghetto rioters. Quote, "The urban disorders of the summer of 1967, end quote, it declared unequivocally, were not caused, nor were they consequences of any organized plan or conspiracy." After reviewing all of the federal government's intelligence report on 23 riots, it found no evidence that all or any of the disorders or the incidents that led to them were planned or directed by any organization or groups, international, national, or local. The Powell report was especially disturbing to Congressman Cornelius E. Gallagher, a New Jersey Democrat, who is the chairman of the House Special Inquiry on Invasion of Privacy. Although congressional use of the right of inquiry into such security-related aspects of running the government has been meager at best, Congressman Gallagher quickly and sternly tackled the issues raised by Powell. On January 6, 1970, Gallagher wrote Army Secretary Stanley Rezer that he was particularly concerned at Powell's report that the plethora of data collected on civilians by the Army was to be stored in and disseminated from a computerized data bank at Fort Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland, and pointed out that such a data center would be in violation of agreements established in 1968. Gallagher wrote further that if Powell had accurately described the activity, it would represent an unconscionable and unconstitutional threat to privacy and spontaneity of Americans. A month later, in lieu of a reply to specific assurances sought by Gallagher, the Army's General Counsel, Robert Gordon, wrote a letter conceding that the collection of civil disturbance-related information by the Army increased after the disturbance in Detroit in 1967. The two men met personally 2 days later, and Gallagher reported to the press on February 27, 1970, that Jordan had given further assurances that, number one, Mr. Jordan further emphasized that the list of unidentifiable individuals had been withdrawn, including all blacklists. Number two, Jordan would further recommend to Secretary Rezer that should the Army feel that increased surveillance over domestic activities was called for, such as the erection of a data bank, that Congress will be consulted. Despite the Army's assurances, more credible sources believe that the Army likely had already microfilmed and stored in the Pentagon all data it has said had been destroyed at Fort Holabird. During the decisive decade, individual congressmen who oppose the nation's police and war machine have not scored very highly. Even in this instance, Gallagher's courage was more evident than his success, but an indication of the extent to which Gallagher had become aroused was revealed in his remarks a week later, on March 1st, 1970, to the New Jersey American Civil Liberties Union, one of the organizations Pyle had listed as being under Army intelligence surveillance. Quote, "My friends," he told the New Jersey group, "never before in our history has a group of basic concepts embodied in the first 10 amendments to our Constitution been under such constant and concerted attack as now." You guys, I have to end for tonight. I will continue. We are on page 234, and I will be back to continue very soon, maybe in a couple of days. Thank you all so much for being here and listening to this book. Please like this video and share it out with many people as you can. I look forward to seeing you for part 6 very soon. Take care, everybody.